Before cocaine, before opium, there was sugar, the first global addiction. It looked harmless, but it ruled entire nations. It filled the pockets of kings, built cities, and turned the Caribbean into a machine powered by human suffering. Every teaspoon carried the weight of chains and screams. The men behind it weren't farmers, they were the first drug lords of the Americas, rich, ruthless, and untouchable. And the world they built still controls us in ways most people never notice. In today's world, sugar hides in nearly everything. Soft drinks, cereal, sauces, even bread. People crave it without knowing why. The addiction feels harmless, yet it controls choices, moods, and markets, just as it did centuries ago when it first arrived in Europe. Europe's taste for sweetness began with nobility. For them, sugar was a rare treat, imported at great cost from distant colonies. A small bowl on a dining table could display wealth more clearly than gold. That taste would soon shape entire economies. As sugar became cheaper through trade, its hold on society tightened. Tea, coffee, and chocolate entered daily life, but all depended on one ingredient: sugar. People who once lived without it couldn't imagine a day without its comforting rush. Merchants realized the real treasure wasn't silver or spice but sweetness. Sugar offered endless demand. Every bite people took meant another ship had to sail, another field had to expand, and more human hands were needed to harvest the cane. The Caribbean became the center of this booming industry. Islands like Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint Domingue turned into vast plantations. Green fields stretched to the horizon, lined with cane so tall it swallowed the workers inside its sharp, endless rows. The men who owned these plantations began calling themselves sugar barons. They built grand estates, wore silk imported from Europe, and treated themselves like royalty. But their wealth was soaked in sweat, pain, and the lives of those they enslaved. Ships carrying enslaved Africans arrived at the docks day after day. Each journey was a nightmare. Disease, hunger, and violence took many lives before reaching the islands. The survivors were sold, branded, and forced into the endless rhythm of cane cutting. The work never stopped. Under the sun, bodies bent and muscles tore. The sugar mills demanded speed and precision. Every delay meant lost profit, and every mistake brought punishment. For the barons, pain was cheaper than mercy. On some plantations, life expectancy was only a few years. Fresh ships arrived regularly to replace the dead. To the barons, people were just numbers in their ledgers, their deaths balanced against rising sugar prices in London and Paris. Europe's elite drank their sweetened tea without thought. They enjoyed comfort purchased through cruelty. In drawing rooms and parlors, they praised progress, unaware that it depended on the suffering of thousands who never saw the world beyond the cane fields. Every ton of sugar sent across the ocean carried stories that would never be told. The chains, the songs of the enslaved, the ashes of burned fields, these were the hidden costs of every dessert and every refined crystal on European tables. Sugar became more than food, it was power. Whoever controlled it controlled economies, politics, and war. Nations competed for islands, not for their beauty, but for their soil, the kind that could feed the empire's endless hunger for sweetness. Britain, France, and Spain fought over these islands like gamblers fighting for the last coin on the table. Each victory meant new plantations, new slaves, and more ships carrying both wealth and misery across the Atlantic. Plantations became fortresses of greed. Owners ruled with whips and guns, fearing rebellion. Overseers watched from towers, ensuring no worker rested too long or spoke too freely. The barons lived in fear of those whose labor made them rich. In the darkness of the cane fields, people shared stories and prayers in whispers. They built hidden communities, held on to fragments of home, and sang songs that carried memory and hope across generations that knew only labor and chains. Runaways fled into forests and mountains, creating free settlements where the barons' reach could not follow. These marooned communities became symbols of defiance, proof that even in bondage, freedom could still find a heartbeat. The sugar barons saw resistance as infection. They answered with cruelty meant to break spirit and will. Yet each punishment fueled deeper hatred, and every death planted the seed of rebellion that could not be erased. Saint Domingue became the richest colony in the world, producing almost half of Europe's sugar. Its wealth was unmatched, but beneath it was a pressure that no empire could contain, a society built entirely on suffering and control. Whispers of revolt began to spread through the cane fields. The barons dismissed it as idle talk, believing the enslaved would never dare rise against their guns and chains. But those whispers carried the weight of centuries of rage. The first sparks of rebellion appeared when fields were set ablaze at night. Flames consumed the crops, the mills, and the profits that once seemed untouchable. For the first time, the empire trembled at the thought of losing control. The fire spread faster than any army could move. Men and women once bound in servitude now fought for freedom. Entire plantations fell to ash, and the world's richest colony turned into a battlefield. This uprising would become known as the Haitian Revolution. It was the first successful revolt by enslaved people in the New World. The sugar barons' empire began to crack as they watched their power crumble under the weight of justice. France lost its crown jewel, and with it, the illusion of control. Haiti's freedom sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. The sugar empire had shown its weakness. Its profits depended on people who had nothing left to lose. Fear gripped every plantation across the Caribbean. Owners built more fences, hired more guards, and tightened the laws. They thought fear could keep order, but it only deepened the divide between master and worker, ruler and ruled. While the barons fought to protect their fortunes, the world began to see the truth. The sweetness on European tables was not luxury. It was cruelty, disguised as comfort, and that realization marked the beginning of the sugar empire's slow decay. Empires turned their armies toward the Caribbean again, desperate to protect what remained. Britain, France, and Spain each wanted control over the surviving islands, not for glory or territory, but for sugar, the product that could still fill their treasuries. Battles erupted across the sea. Ships carrying cannons and sugar both crossed the same waters. Forts rose on coasts to protect warehouses stacked with barrels of sweetness that had become more valuable than any weapon of war. Plantations that survived the revolts began rebuilding. New enslaved workers arrived to replace those lost to rebellion or death. The sugar barons refused to see the end coming, believing their wealth could rebuild the world around them again. The Caribbean islands turned into laboratories of greed. Every inch of land was measured for output. Every human life counted in pounds of sugar. The system kept grinding forward, even as the world outside began to change. Across the Atlantic, whispers of morality began to reach polite society. Abolitionist groups started questioning how civilization could call itself modern while running on blood-soaked sugar. Pamphlets spread through cities, and for the first time, people began to care. Campaigners held up pieces of sugar beside drawings of chained men, showing how both were part of the same trade. Their message was clear: every sweet cup of tea came at the cost of another's freedom. Some families refused to buy sugar grown by slaves. They called it blood sweet. Small shops began labeling their goods differently, offering sugar from sources that claimed to be free, though even those often carried the same hidden cruelty. The barons fought back with propaganda. They hired writers and priests to defend the system, calling it necessary for empire. But their words carried less power as public conscience began to outweigh luxury, and people started asking where sweetness truly came from. As the British Parliament debated abolition, plantation owners warned that ending slavery would destroy the economy. They painted grim pictures of ruin and famine, ignoring that the real ruin already lived in the fields under their control. When slavery was finally abolished in Britain's colonies, the barons didn't disappear. They adapted. They turned to new methods that looked moral but worked the same. Indentured labor became the next link in the sugar chain. Ships began arriving from India and China, carrying workers bound by contracts they barely understood. They weren't chained, but they were trapped by debt, low wages, and the same endless fields that had consumed generations before them. The barons rebuilt their power under new names. They formed companies, merging small estates into industrial empires. Families like Tate and Lyle rose from merchants to magnates, refining sugar in vast factories instead of open fields. Refineries lined the Thames, their chimneys pouring smoke into London's grey sky. The sweetness that once fueled slavery now powered machines, turning labor into industry and empire into profit. The faces behind it changed, but the hunger stayed the same. Advertising began shaping sugar's new image. Posters showed happy children, bright kitchens, and families smiling around tea sets. The dark fields of the Caribbean vanished from public memory, replaced by the comforting promise of sweetness and home. Factories used slogans that linked sugar with energy, love, and joy. People began believing it was part of a good life. The industry didn't need whips anymore. It had words and dreams to keep consumers under its spell. London's elite invested their fortunes into sugar companies, turning slave wealth into respectable business shares. Banks, museums, and universities were built from these profits, their marble halls hiding the true origins of their funding. Meanwhile, former colonies struggled under broken soil and empty coffers. Their land had been stripped bare, their people left in poverty, and their future tied to the same export that once enslaved them. Sugar remained both blessing and curse. The global appetite for sweetness grew again, spreading from Europe to America. Factories in New York and New Orleans began refining sugar from Caribbean imports, creating new fortunes, while the original producers stayed trapped in debt and dependency. In the United States, cane plantations in Louisiana adopted the same brutal patterns once seen in the islands. Enslaved people worked through storms and heat, watched by overseers who had learned their methods from British and French barons. The American sugar industry became a mirror of its European cousin, built on exploitation, powered by cheap labor, and protected by political influence. Sugar had no loyalty; it served whoever could profit from its addictive pull. Even after emancipation, many freed people found themselves returning to the same fields, tied not by chains but by hunger and debt. The system didn't vanish; it changed its costume and kept collecting the same toll. By the late 1800s, sugar was no longer a luxury, it was a daily necessity. Workers in factories, miners underground, and children in schools all consumed it. The addiction had spread from palaces to tenements, from royal tables to factory floors. Doctors began noticing health problems, decaying teeth, fatigue, and diseases they couldn't yet name. They warned that sugar might be more dangerous than people believed, but no one wanted to hear it. Sweetness felt like happiness, and happiness sold well. The barons' descendants now owned corporations instead of plantations. They wore suits instead of uniforms, but the principle never changed. Keep the product cheap, make it desirable, and let the addiction handle the rest. By the dawn of the 20th century, sugar had conquered the world without a single shot fired. The same substance that once enslaved millions now lived in every home, every kitchen, every craving, and no one questioned who really controlled it. Across Europe, posters and radio ads began tying sugar to comfort and family. It was marketed as energy for the modern worker, a reward for children, and the secret to happiness. No one mentioned that the addiction itself was now the product. Factories expanded to meet growing demand. Huge warehouses stored refined crystals, ready to be shipped across continents. Every grain represented profit, extracted from lands and people still caught in a system of control, disguised as progress and development. The public's memory of slavery faded under layers of convenience and branding. The same industry that once used chains now used marketing slogans. The barons no longer cracked whips, they shaped minds through posters and promises of joy. As cities grew, workers relied on sugar for quick calories. Cheap sweets replaced proper meals. It gave brief energy but no nourishment. The cycle of craving and fatigue kept both factories and consumers locked in endless dependence. Doctors began tracking the effects, noting how entire populations developed diseases tied to sugar. Cavities, obesity, and diabetes spread quietly, just as addiction once had. The substance that built empires now began to weaken the very bodies that consumed it. Governments saw the profits and stayed silent. Taxes on sugar funded wars and public projects. No leader wanted to challenge an industry that filled both stomachs and treasuries. The cycle of sweetness and silence became part of modern governance. In America, corporations refined sugar on a massive scale. Industrialists built vast companies that looked respectable but followed the same pattern: cheap labor, manipulated demand, and wealth gathered in the hands of a few powerful families. The sugar empire learned to hide behind familiar names. Family-owned brands appeared friendly and local, though their wealth stretched across oceans. The faces changed, but the structure remained. The rich at the top, the exploited at the bottom. Tate and Lyle became household names, their refineries a source of pride in London. They promoted themselves as pioneers of cleanliness and progress, yet their success traced straight back to the fields of the Caribbean and the bodies that built them. London's skyline filled with towers built on sugar profits. Grand halls, banks, and universities carried the invisible fingerprints of the barons. Their legacies were rewritten as philanthropy, their crimes rebranded as history too distant to question. Meanwhile, the former colonies were left to rebuild from ruins. Their soil was exhausted, their economies dependent on exporting sugar, and their people still living under systems shaped by the trade that had once enslaved them. In Cuba, sugar became both lifeline and curse. Massive plantations dominated the landscape, owned by foreign investors. Local workers harvested the same cane under new masters, paid in wages too small to escape the cycle of poverty. The pattern repeated in every region touched by the industry. Wherever sugar grew, power concentrated and inequality deepened. The product brought wealth to the few and hunger to the many, echoing the empire's old rhythm under modern names. By the early 20th century, sugar had invaded every aspect of daily life. It appeared in canned food, medicine, and even baby formula. Generations grew up believing sweetness was natural, unaware of the centuries of suffering hidden within it. The connection between sugar and control reappeared during wartime. Governments rationed it, linking its supply to patriotism. Soldiers received sugary rations for energy, while civilians were told to save it for victory. Even in war, sugar remained currency. When peace returned, so did the craving. Companies launched new brands, soft drinks and candies to rebuild the market. They sold sugar, not just as food, but as emotion, comfort, reward, celebration. The addiction became cultural, not just physical. Scientists studying brain chemistry discovered that sugar triggered pleasure responses similar to narcotics. It offered quick relief from fatigue and sadness, creating the same pull once found in the drug trades that followed its path centuries earlier. The old sugar routes never disappeared, they simply evolved. Cargo ships replaced slave ships, and factories replaced plantations, yet both systems served the same masters: profit, consumption, and a dependence that reached across continents. In boardrooms, executives studied consumer behavior like plantation owners once studied yield. Their goal was identical: produce more, sell faster, and keep the buyer hooked. The sugar empire had learned the art of invisible control. Marketing shifted from sweetness to science. Ads promised energy, health, and vitality. Sugar became an ingredient in sports drinks, breakfast bars, and medicines. It hid under new names, escaping guilt while strengthening its hold over the global diet. The industry's power reached deep into politics. Lobbyists blocked research and pressured officials to downplay health concerns. The same greed that once ignored human suffering now ignored scientific warnings, keeping the world addicted through policy and persuasion. In developing countries, farmers still worked long hours for low pay, harvesting crops that would never feed their own families. The wealth their labor created flowed outward, leaving them stuck in poverty built from centuries of global imbalance. The sugar barons of history had used chains, the modern ones used contracts and markets. Both forms of control served the same end: keeping the flow of sweetness steady and ensuring that no one questioned who truly benefited. Historians began to connect the dots, showing how the same trade routes, banking systems, and corporate families linked the old sugar empires to modern capitalism. The addiction that began with taste had evolved into an entire economic system. By the mid-20th century, sugar no longer needed violence to rule. Its control was psychological, cultural, and economic. The world didn't fear it, they celebrated it. Yet beneath the sweetness, the same machine of greed still turned, quietly unchanged. Across the Atlantic, new plantations appeared in Brazil and Southeast Asia. Though slavery was banned, the same hunger for cheap labor persisted. Workers toiled long hours under contracts designed to keep them poor, producing sugar for distant, wealthier nations. Machines replaced hand tools, but the rhythm of exploitation never changed. The world called it progress, yet it relied on the same imbalance: comfort for some, exhaustion for others. Every ton of sugar still carried an invisible human cost. Cities in Europe and America thrived on the trade. Their ports grew busy again, filled with ships carrying sugar, rum, and molasses. Entire industries, banking, shipping, and real estate continued to feed on the legacy of the old barons. In advertisements, sugar was sold as the heartbeat of modern life. It powered morning coffee, afternoon snacks, and evening desserts. People didn't see addiction, they saw tradition, unaware that the system had been built to keep them dependent forever. Governments introduced subsidies to protect local production. These policies rewarded large corporations while small farmers struggled to survive. The empire had dissolved, but the hierarchy remained, disguised under trade laws and economic language that hid old patterns of control. Health officials began sounding alarms, linking sugar to disease on a massive scale. Yet public campaigns failed against billion-dollar advertising. The industry learned long ago that if you make addiction feel normal, truth will always sound like exaggeration. In schools, children grew up seeing sugar as celebration, birthdays, holidays, rewards. Culture itself became a carrier for the addiction. By the time they understood its grip, it was already part of every memory and emotion they valued most. Corporations expanded into new products, blending sugar into snacks, drinks, and processed meals. Consumers believed they had choices, but nearly every brand, every shelf, led back to the same small network of powerful companies tracing their roots to the past. The old trade routes transformed into modern supply chains, stretching across oceans, but serving the same idea: control demand, dominate distribution, and never let the consumer realize how deep the dependence runs. It was empire without ships or flags. Scientists studying human behavior compared sugar's effects to those of narcotics. Brain scans showed similar patterns of craving and reward. The first drug lords had simply chosen a substance that hid behind innocence. A drug society would defend instead of fear. In documentaries and research papers, historians began uncovering names long forgotten. They traced modern corporations to families who once traded slaves, proving how neatly the past had disguised itself in new forms of business and polished corporate branding. The same banks that once financed slave ships now funded food giants. The flow of money never stopped. It only changed direction. Every stage of modern industry carried echoes of the same transactions that once priced human lives in barrels of sugar. In former colonies, people still fought to reclaim land once stolen for cane. Decades of monocrop farming had left soil depleted and communities dependent. Their economies could not escape the shadow of the trade that began centuries before. Even modern poverty maps follow the old sugar routes. The richest cities remain those that once controlled the trade, while the poorest regions are the lands that harvested it. History didn't fade, it became the foundation of global inequality. Consumers began noticing how difficult it was to avoid sugar. Labels disguised it under dozens of names. Even foods sold as healthy carried it in secret. The system thrived on confusion, making awareness feel like resistance, and resistance feel impossible. Every attempt to regulate the industry met fierce opposition. Lobbyists claimed personal freedom was at risk, using the same arguments their ancestors made to defend slavery: profit over humanity, disguised as liberty and choice. The rhetoric barely changed. The irony grew sharper. The same substance once produced by slaves now enslaved consumers in a different way. It no longer required chains or overseers, just habit, marketing, and a constant need for another small taste of comfort. Meanwhile, global corporations invested billions in research to make sugar more addictive and cheaper to produce. Engineers designed substitutes and blends that fooled the tongue but kept the brain's craving alive, ensuring the demand would never fade. The developing world became both supplier and victim. Nations that once suffered under colonial rule now struggled with health crises tied to the very commodity that had built those empires. History's cycle had come full circle, still feeding itself. In museums, visitors admired portraits of the old barons without realizing their connection to the present. Their legacies were celebrated as pioneers of trade, while the real cost, the broken lives and stolen generations, remained buried under polished plaques. Even the word refined carried irony. The process that cleaned sugar of its impurities was the same system that cleaned history of its guilt, presenting something pure while hiding everything it took to make it look that way. For every spoonful of sugar stirred into coffee, there exists an unseen chain of laborers, factories, ships, and shareholders, all repeating a pattern born from empire. The product seems simple, but its roots stretch deep into the bones of civilization. The sweetness that comforted generations came from an inheritance of pain. What began as a craving became a civilization's cornerstone, a quiet addiction that shaped nations, economies, and the way the world measures happiness itself. The barons may have died centuries ago, but their power structure never truly vanished. Their descendants wear different clothes and sit in boardrooms instead of plantations, yet they still profit from the same endless appetite for sweetness. Sugar built empires, broke nations, and shaped the modern world. The first drug lords of the Americas didn't sell powder or smoke, they sold sweetness, and centuries later, their empire still rules, hidden in plain sight on every kitchen shelf.